Disability campaigners said tonight they are extremely disappointed by a legal ruling over the rights of wheelchair users on buses. Doug Pawley, who uses a wheelchair, was told he couldn't get on a bus when a mother with a pushchair refused to move from the wheelchair bay. He took the company First Bus to court, saying their wheelchair policy was discriminatory, and he won. But today the Court of Appeal overturned that judgment, as Porrick O'Brien explains.
It all started mundanely enough. 2 years ago, Doug Pawley got on a bus to Leeds to see his parents. In the wheelchair space, a pushchair with a sleeping child inside. Its mother was asked by the driver to move the buggy, but she wouldn't. Mr. Pawley had to wait for the next bus. A case was brought challenging the First Bus policy of requesting, not requiring, non-disabled travellers to vacate space needed by a wheelchair user. Mr. Pawley won. But today, in the Court of Appeal, that decision was overruled. The gist of the ruling: the needs of wheelchair users do not trump all other considerations.
I do not believe that the fact that some passengers will, albeit rarely, act selfishly and irresponsibly is a sufficient reason for imposing on bus companies a legal responsibility for a situation which is not of their making and which they're not in a position to prevent.
Wheelchair campaigners will see this as a bad day for disabled people's rights.
Yes, they will, and that is unfortunate. As I say, every day thousands of wheelchair users use buses successfully. We welcome all disabled people onto our buses. They're hugely important customers of ours. But it is very, very difficult for the driver, and I think we have to think of the driver in the situation. The law is not behind him compelling somebody to leave the vehicle. So all he can do, as he does now, or she does now, is use their reasonable powers, reasonable persuasion to move away and to let the wheelchair user have access to that space.
Also in the High Court today, a group of people lost their bid to challenge how the government decided to wind down the Independent Living Fund. Afterwards, we asked them about the First Bus ruling.
Obviously, we're gutted because it's just another sort of thing that we've had to fight for over the last sort of 20, 30 years to get accessible transport, and then they're sort of saying, well, actually, those spaces are not really for you, they're for whoever gets there first.
Have you ever had that, though? Have you ever been refused a space because somebody else was there with a pushchair or like that?
Well, do you know, I'm not going to make this a divisive issue, because that's the thing everybody wants it to be. They want it to be a divisive issue, like us against prams. You know, I love babies too, you know, and I want to share that space. If we can work it out and do that, I think it's about having a sensible resolve with these sorts of things.
Today's ruling is, of course, about much more than prams versus wheelchairs. It's about who's entitled to what when common sense breaks down.
Porrick O'Brien reporting. Well, Doug Pawley joins us now live from Leeds, and here with me is Simon Posner from the Confederation of Passenger Transport UK, who are the trade body for the bus and coach industry. Doug Pawley, the judge in effect said that he didn't believe the needs of wheelchair users should trump the needs of others, namely parents in this case, with a pushchair. I mean, what's your response to that?
I think that, frankly, he got it wrong. We believe very strongly that the Equality Act was designed to correct the bias, the difficulties that disabled people face day to day. You know, that wheelchair space is a wheelchair space. It was always designed as a wheelchair space and intended as one. There wouldn't be a wheelchair space or a space on a bus if it wasn't for the campaigning efforts of disabled people who chained themselves to buses in the 1990s. And whilst I do appreciate that it's very difficult to get on a bus with a buggy and maybe other siblings and so on, ultimately it's a wheelchair space. And if that wheelchair space isn't available to wheelchair users, we can't get on, you know. Buggies can be folded.
Doug makes a fair point there. It is a wheelchair space.
He's absolutely right, and I agree with what he's saying. Actually, I have to say that's not what we interpret the judge as having said today, that it's equal for buggy users as well. Today was a case about the reasonableness and what drivers can and can't compel people to do. That space is very, very clearly there for wheelchair users, and we will continue to ask politely and firmly anyone who's in that place to move it.
But I mean, clearly Doug's experience shows that that's not working, doesn't it, all the time?
It didn't work in this case. And I think if I remember reading what I have read of the judgment, it doesn't seem like it's a regular problem that Doug's had here, but it's something that people need to work together, and bus drivers need to work together. Today's case wasn't about saying that's for anyone other than a wheelchair user. It's about how much force the driver can use.
I mean, Doug, do you accept that from the driver's point of view, it is extremely difficult that because there is no legally binding arrangement here, they don't want to get involved, they're unable to get involved effectively in a terrible scrap when common sense breaks down, shall we say?
Yes, I would hate to be a driver. I've got immense respect for them. It must be a very difficult job, not just driving, but, you know, you have to deal with antisocial behaviour all the time. People eating smelly food, as was discussed a lot in the case, arguing, fighting, playing the music too loud. They have to deal with such conflict all the time, and they have a battery of techniques and training which helps them to deal with that.
But can you see why they wouldn't want to get involved in what may become quite an ugly row between a wheelchair user and a woman refusing to move with a buggy?
Yes, nobody wants to be in that situation, neither do I as the wheelchair user. I would hope, though, that if the law had said differently, if it had come down on the side of the wheelchair user having priority, that would have given the drivers some extra ammunition, some extra leverage to make that space available.
I mean, Simon Posner, we've covered the very many problems disabled travellers can face getting access to transport. I mean, there will be many who say this gives carte blanche to your drivers now to see a person in a wheelchair at a bus stop and just drive straight past.
That's absolutely not the case. We do a huge amount of money, we put up a huge amount of money, put a huge amount of time into training drivers to make sure they don't do that. 99% of the time this problem doesn't exist, but our wheelchair users, in fact all our disabled passengers, are massively important for us, and we've made huge strides to make sure they get on. We don't want to see a problem here. All we sought was clarification.
But would you like to see the law changed in favour of making it absolutely rigid that this is a wheelchair
We've got to
space for no one else?
We then need to find out who is going to enforce that law, but that place is for wheelchair users. Every sign on the bus makes that absolutely plain.
But clearly in those instances where it doesn't work, disabled people in wheelchairs can be left at the side of the road as buses go by, we know that.
It can happen thankfully, that's something that happens very rarely. People get left at the side of the road if a bus is full on more than one occasion, I can assure you. But you've got to reiterate that this is a very isolated case, and wheelchair users and all disabled people use our buses on a regular basis every day.
Doug Paulley, do you accept that this is an isolated incident and that, in fact, you know, you can be a mum with a buggy and a couple of kids and the bus can still drive past you because there's no room?
I'm not saying that we're the only people who struggle on public transport, but what I can say is that there's been an awful number of people who have expressed considerable support for the case because they have experienced similar themselves up and down the country, and other companies such as Stagecoach say on their terms and conditions of carriage that other passengers must give up the space if required by a wheelchair user.
So very briefly, what would you like Simon to do?
I'd like Simon to join me in seeking proper clarity, which the judgment doesn't give, in supporting our appeal to the Supreme Court so that we have an answer absolutely clearly as to what the situation is.
Doug Paulley and Simon Posner, thank you very much for joining us. John.
It is a brain disease.